Welcome back Chessbox Worldwide, where we put the spotlight on the fiercest clashes from the Zabasajja Memorial 2025. Today, we dissect an encounter fueled not just by strategy, but by vengeance. Just one round earlier, the former SOM Open champion, candidate master Egesa Emmanuel, brought the young Dara to tears with a devastating loss. Tandeka, the older brother, offered just 3 quiet words of comfort. Bas, bas, bas. But later that evening, when the pairings were released, the comfort turned to a clear mission. Tandeka knew it was time for his little brother's revenge. On one side, we have the former champion and the ruthless candidate master Egesa Emmanuel, steering with the white pieces and immediately imposing his will. His game plan is clear. A relentless, suffocating kingside attack. Against him, wielding the black pieces, is the resilient Tandeka Shiloh, the gold medalist from the 2025 East Africa Junior Championship. While the rating difference suggests an uphill battle, Tandeka brings the hunger for battle, a determination driven by family loyalty, refusing to be intimidated. The game transforms into a desperate two-front war as Egesa's rooks charge up the kingside. Tandeka's pawns become maze-outs, forcing Egesa to choose either to defend the king or face the inevitable B-pawn. The match culminates in a tactical explosion. Watch as Tandeka, against the odds, navigates the complexities with a surgical precision, utilizing his advanced pawns to squeeze life out of Egesa's position. This game is a testament to the fact that in chess, the heart of a fighter often trumps the rating on the sheet. It's a lesson in counterplay, a masterclass in a calculated risk, and a stunning personal victory. Get ready to witness the Makindye mayhem. This is candidate master Egesa vs Tandeka, only on Chessbox Worldwide. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment to support the channel and help us bring you more epic chess stories. And in the white pieces, candidate master Egesa Emmanuel opened the game with 1d4, and Tandeka Shiloh played c5. We see d5, which introduces us to the Benoni defense. Knight comes to f6. We see c4, e6, challenging the center. Knight comes to c3, pawn takes, and we see d6, e4, g6, opening up for the bishop to sit on g7, f4, the pawn storm, queen e7. He played knight f3. In this position, the pawn on e4 is untouchable. For example, in case of knight takes e4, then queen f4 check, checking the king and winning the knight on e4 on the spot. That's why after knight f3, tried knight d7. But however, in this position, bishop g4 is interesting, followed by bishop g7 are moves which can be considered in the position, followed by bishop coming to b5 check. But however, he played knight d7. Candidate master Egesa Emmanuel went and played bishop d3. But however, there was another brilliant idea in the position, beginning with pawn e4, hitting on the knight, and in case of pawn takes e5, then knight b5, putting an eye on the weak spots, and in case of pawn takes f4, opening up for discovery on the king, then bishop e2, defending the check, and now the knight is putting an eye on the c7 square. In case of queen d8, defending the check, then d6, and this would give white a huge advantage and so many attacking possibilities in the position. But however, after knight d7, he played bishop d3, just defending the pawn, bishop g7, intending to go ahead for short castling from Egesa, short castling from Tandeka, and in this position, Egesa went in and played queen c2. But however, rook e1 should have been considered, and in case of knight h5, trying to open up for the bishop and open up for the pawn, bishop c2, b5, and after knight takes b5, s6, knight comes c3, rook b8, rook b1, and in case of rook comes to e8, h3, bishop comes to b7, g4, this would give Egesa a huge advantage. But however, after short castling, he played queen c2, s6, intending to go ahead and expand on the queen side, a4, stopping the advance on the queen side, b6, stopping any further a5 ideas. Emma went on and played bishop d2 with a knight e8, trying to route the knight to come in and support the b5 break. So we see rook comes to e1, knight c7, and in this position, Emmanuel went and played h4. But however, b3 should have been considered, and in case of b5, could have seen h3, after rook comes to e8, knight comes to d1, knight f6, bishop comes to f5, and in case of rook b8, queen d2, queen comes to d7, rook f2, followed by pawn takes f4. But however, after knight c7, he played h4, and Tandeka went on and played rook b8, intending to go ahead for the queenside expansion, h5, And in case of pawn taking h5, then white can always go ahead and advance further in the center, hitting on the pawn which is on h7 and can open up a devastating attack. That's why in this position, Tandeka played b5, b3 from Egesa, and in this position, Tandeka went on and played c4. But however, knight f6 should have been considered, and in case of f5, you could have seen knight g4, e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5 with a pleasant continuation. But however, after b3, he played c4 and Emmanuel went on ahead and played pawn takes c4, and in this position, Tandeka didn't bother to take either of the pawns. He advanced further with the pawn b4, which was an interesting suggestion, creating a passed pawn, and now he threatened to go ahead and advance further the pawn to graduate into queen. Knight comes to e2, and we see b3 hitting on the queen, queen b1, trying to obstruct the pawn from further advancement. Remember, the pawn is backed up by the bishop, which is slicing the whole of the board. Knight comes to c5, hitting on which is on d3, and also putting an eye on the pawn which is on e4. We see knight comes to d4, opening up for the rook to defend the pawn, supported also by the bishop. Bishop d7, attacking the pawn on f4. We see f5 defending the pawn. Rook comes to b7, planning to go ahead and pile the two rooks on the same file. e5, opening up for the bishop attack. Now we see the bishop and the queen are joining hands to put more emphasis and attack on the king. Bishop comes to e8, and we see rook comes to f2, trying to cut off any further advancements of the pawn. f6, challenging the center, and in this position, Emmanuel went and played e6, advancing further. Now look at the battery of all these pawns, but Tandeka doesn't want to mind. He's still pushing on because he needs to give his brother a sweetest revenge he promised him. Tandeka played f5, now opening once again for the bishop. Bishop c3 should have been considered, and in case of knight f4, we could have seen bishop a1, followed by rook coming to b4. Could have seen queen c1, b2, and in case of rook takes b2, knight takes d5, sacrificing the knight and also opening up for the queen to come into attack. C takes d5, we see rook takes d4, and after h6, hitting on the bishop, bishop f6 with a promising attack. But however, after f5, Emma played pawn takes g6, and Tandeka played pawn takes g6. In this position, he went on and played, he sacrificed his bishop on f5, but however, g3 should have been considered, just a slow move. In case of bishop coming to f6, we could have seen king g2, opening up for the rook to put all the dangerous attacks on the king side. Queen g7, bishop c3 defending the knight, which is sitting on d4. Knight f4, we could have seen bishop comes to a1, rook comes to b4, and in case of rook coming to f2, knight comes to c5, rook comes to c1, followed by knight f4. But however, after pawn takes g6, Emmanuel played bishop takes f5, of which Tandeka went on and played with pawn takes f5. But however, rook takes f5 should have been considered. Tandeka played pawn takes f5, played knight takes f5, and now we see that he's attacking all the soft spots, and it was high time for Tandeka to go on and play rook takes f5, and in case of queen takes f5, queen f6 with a pleasant playable game. This would give black a slight advantage. But however, after knight takes f5, he played queen f6, and in this position, Emmanuel could go ahead and win the game by playing knight takes g7. For example, after knight takes g7, we could have seen king takes g7, g4, king comes to g8, rook h2 with a promising attack. But however, after queen f6, he played knight takes d6, trying to create passed pawns. We see bishop comes to g6, pawn f5, and after bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, queen takes f5, we see e7 hitting on the rook, and in case the rook goes ahead to obstruct the pawn, now the queen will be free. That's why we see rook f7. Now pawn goes to e8, graduating into queen. Knight takes e8, rook takes e8 check, and after bishop f8, we played queen takes f5, rook takes f5, and we see rook f1. King comes to f7, hitting on the rook. Rook comes back to e1, and it was in this position that Tandeka went and played bishop d6. But however, king g8 should have been considered, and in case of rook e8, we could see b2, pushing the passed pawn, rook b1 blocking the pawn from graduating into queen, king f7, and after rook e2, bishop comes to g7 defending the pawn, bishop e3, rook comes to e7, and after king f1, knight comes to e4, bishop f2. This would give Tandeka a huge advantage. But however, after rook e1, he played bishop d6, and now Emmanuel went and played bishop c3. But however, g4 should have been considered, and in case of rook f6, we could have seen g5, and after rook comes back to f5, knight e5 check. And remember, the rook is pinned, and you don't have, even if you take the knight which is sitting here on e5 with the bishop, still the rook which is on f5 would be falling. But however, after bishop d6, he played bishop c3, and we see king g8, see knight d2, and we see rook takes f1 check. After rook takes f1, we see b2 from Shiloh, rook b1, blocking the pawn from graduating into queen. Knight comes to f4, hitting on the bishop which is on c3, bishop d4, and in this position he played bishop b4. A double hit on the knight and also the pawn which is on f5. Knight comes to e4, we see bishop takes pawn, and now d6, rook comes to b4, knight comes to d2, and in this position he played rook b7, opening up another attack on the knight, c5, and you can't go ahead and take the knight because these two powerful pawns can be very powerful if they are pushed. But in this position, Tandeka played knight takes c5. After knight takes c5, in case of bishop takes c5, then bishop takes d2, and after d7, then bishop f5, defending against the pawn and also insisting and defending the pawn which is on b2. And I can tell you, this would still be equal, but the king would always come in, and the pawn which is on d7 would always fall, and Tandeka would go on to win. But however, after knight takes c5, he tried knight c4, and you see rook b4, bishop takes c5, rook takes c4. In this position, bishop a3 should have been considered, but he played rook takes b2, sacrificing the piece, and Tandeka went on and played rook takes c5, and after rook comes to b8 check, king f7. And remember also, the square where the pawn is queening from is being seen by the bishop which is sitting on a8. After rook comes to a8, trying to eliminate the passed pawn, rook comes c6, defending the pawn, d7, and the king instantly came in with e7, preventing the pawn from advancing forward. King comes to f2, king takes d7, g4, king e6, coming back again to attack the pawn, king d3. In this position, bishop c3 should have been considered, followed by g5, and then king comes to d5. But however, he played king f6, rook f8 check, and after king g7, rook a8, bishop comes to b4. Now he wants to begin pushing the passed pawn. g5, we see a5, king comes in to be following the pawn, bishop comes to d2, and now he's insisting to go ahead and also attack or either bring in the king. Rook comes to d8, hitting on the bishop, bishop c1, and now the pawn can always advance forward to be defended by the bishop which is on c1. Rook comes to d5, we see f4, and after rook comes to f5, a3, being defended by the bishop on c1. King comes to h5, we see rook c7, king comes to g4, rook e7, king f5, we see bishop b2, king d4, rook e1, rook s7 check, king comes to g6, rook s6 check, king f7, and this position. In this position, king f5 should have been considered, but he played rook a7. We see rook a7 check, rook comes to e7, defending from the check, rook a6, we see rook comes to e5, rook a7 check, king comes to e6. Now he wants to bring the king to support the pawn from graduating. We see rook s6 check, and after king d5, we see g6. Now he's insisting on advancing further for the pawn, and Tandeka played rook e6, challenging the pawn and also the rook. So Emma played rook a5 check. We see king c4. The king is coming to b3 to defend the pawn to advance into queen. And also remember, you can't also go ahead and play g7 because of the immediate rook check, which loses the pawn on the spot. Emma played king f5, and Tandeka played that. Tandeka delivered the ultimate blow in the position. I would like to give you some minutes and think of the move Tandeka played. Tandeka, man on a mission for vacancy. He played rook e5 check, and after rook takes e5, bishop takes e5. You don't have time even to go ahead and push the pawn because the bishop can take the pawn instantly. King takes bishop, and we see a2, and after black is queening in check, endgame tactics. King f6 trying to defend the pawn, queen check, and after king comes to f7, queen a7 check, king comes to f8. This is just a matter of time for Tandeka to crack the codes. Queen c5 check, and after king g8, we see queen c6, c8 check, king comes to h7, queen h3 check, king goes to g8, queen e6 check, and after king h8, there's king h8, and in case you go ahead and take the pawn, this would be a stalemate. In case of queen takes g6, this is a stalemate. That's why after king h8, Tandeka played queen f6 check, and after king comes to h7, we see king d5, g7, and now queen pins the pawn. After king goes to h8, Queen h5 check. After king g8, he played king e6, and we see that now checkmate is inevitable in case of king coming to f8. In case of king coming to f8, queen f7 would be checkmate. This was move 88. Egesa resigned the game. Dara got his sweet revenge through his elder brother, Tandeka Shiloh. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck in your games.